Vivian is the first ever Ether Anomaly agent released, and guys, this character's actually pretty crazy. She's a fantastic Anomaly agent who does feel similar to a character like Bernice, and because of this, I tested every single team composition that could possibly include her. So today, I'll be showing you how to play her, what her strengths and weaknesses are, and the shocking findings I had while testing every single team she can be used in. But as always, the goal with today's video is to give you guys a better idea of whether Vivian is worth it on your account. Before we go further, I'd like to remind you all that the footage from today's video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. However, with this out of the way, let's break down every Vivian team in ZenlessZoneZero. Vivian's gameplay focuses on a few major mechanics, but they aren't as complicated as it seems. To summarize her identity though, Vivian is a semi-off-field Anomaly DPS support who performs well by generating feathers, leaving the field, and then activating said feathers through other agents, dealing massive Anomaly damage. To be more specific though, Vivian is great at chaining ether damage through a cycle of skills, powered by flight and guard feathers. Her attacks deal bonus attribute Anomaly damage when enemies are affected by anomalies, and she generates flight feathers through skills like her ultimate and chain attack, allowing her to enter the fluttering frog state. This skill is pretty difficult to say, so I'm going to call it the flight state. However, this is where she unleashes her powerful ether AoEs and gains guard feathers. These guard feathers enable another attack, Feather Bloom, and this is activated when allies apply anomalies or use EX special attacks, even while Vivian is off field. This makes her ideal for supporting anomaly focused teams, but in addition to all the previous mechanics described, her Noblewoman state enhances mobility and survivability with auto dodges and perfect dodge counters, while transitioning smoothly into the flying state for burst damage. Altogether, Vivian plays quite similarly to Bernice, where she aims to generate her unique resources and swap off field the moment she can support her fellow Anomaly agents, but all of this is going on while she's also continuously dealing damage too. Now it's time we talk about her actual kit mechanics. Like usual, this next section is an explanation and summary of Vivian's mechanics, but the actual full breakdown will come in the later guide, so stay tuned for that. Now normally I would start the section with Vivian's core passive, but instead I wanted to break down the 4 major mechanics that make up Vivian's kit. The Noblewoman state is a phase that Vivian enters after performing certain actions, and this includes things like the 4th hit of her Feathered Strike combo, a perfect dodge, or a quick assist. While in this state, Vivian gains access to Noblewoman Waltz, which restores flight feathers and grants invulnerability. Now while these are impactful by themselves, Noblewoman Waltz can lead / directly transition into her fluttering state, and this is incredibly important for her impact on a team. The flying state is Vivian's high damage and vulnerable burst phase, activated by consuming flight feathers or through other means like using Noblewoman Waltz while flight feathers are available. In this form, she can use Fluttering Frog's Suspension, a powerful ether AoE that consumes all flight feathers and converts them into guard feathers. This state can be entered manually or after certain moves like her ultimate, EX special attack, or assist follow-up, but while in said flying state, she can also auto-trigger an attack known as Suspension after being swapped to another agent. That said, this long animation can also be cancelled early by holding the basic attack input, so keep this in mind when playing Vivian. Now you might have noticed that I've talked a lot about this feather mechanic a few times, so let's now actually break this down. Flight feathers are Vivian's core resource used to enter Fluttering Frog state. Additionally, she can convert these flight feathers to guard feathers through the move known as Suspension that we just mentioned earlier. However, let's talk first about how to specifically obtain them. Vivian gains 2 flight feathers from entering the battlefield, 5 from using her ultimate, 2 from using her chain attack, and 3 from using her EX special. Now as mentioned earlier, once gathered, Vivian's actual goal with these feathers is to convert them to guard feathers, as this is where her actual damage comes from. Now regarding guard feathers, these are important for a few reasons. This is because it allows her to auto trigger Feather Bloom when allies apply anomalies or use their EX special attacks using guard feathers, and this can also be done when off field too. To add to this, Vivian is capable of storing up to 5 guard feathers, but in case you were curious, this does not mean you have to use all 5 at once. Using them as you gather them is fine too. With these mechanics out of the way, let's now actually talk about her core passive. When Vivian's Feather Bloom attack or Suspension hits a target affected by any attribute anomaly, it inflicts Vivian's Prophecy, dealing continuous ether damage that can trigger additional anomaly effects. Next, if Feather Bloom hits a specific anomaly like ether, electric, fire, physical, or ice, it triggers a bloom, which is the core mechanic of Vivian's kit. This attack deals bonus anomaly damage based on Vivian's anomaly proficiency, but in addition to this, Vivian also gains 2 flight feathers upon entering the battlefield, which will be incredibly important as we'll see later in this video. Now next, we should talk about Vivian's additional ability, Prophetic Tears. This This activates when another character in the squad is either an Anomaly character or shares the same attribute as her, and when this condition is met, every time a squad member activates an attribute Anomaly on an enemy, Vivian automatically consumes 1 guard feather to then launch a basic attack at said target. This can be triggered every half second, but in addition to this, the entire squad benefits from a 12% increase in corruption damage, and disorders created by the corruption status also gain a 12% increase too. Now let's break down her skills and moves. Vivian has a couple basic attacks, so let's break them down first. Feathered Strike is her generic 4-hit combo, dealing physical and ether damage, but it also allows her to enter the Noble Woman state after the 4th hit. In Noble Woman, using a basic attack activates Noble Woman Waltz, which deals ether damage, restores 1 flight feather, and can also trigger the flight state if feathers are available. In the fluttering state, using a basic attack will then activate Suspension, which is the mechanic that we mentioned earlier for converting feathers. But aside from the conversion, this attack does deal decent AoE ether damage while also consuming the feathers. Feather Bloom is an attack that Vivian consumes 1 guard feather to perform, and this deals ether damage when any ally performs an EX special attack against an enemy. Now that said, there are also 2 important details here to note, and the first is the fact that she can do this off field, while the second is that she can store up to 5 of these guard feathers at a time. Side note, a major optimization and tip for the flying state is to immediately swap off of Vivian once she performs it. And as you're seeing here, assuming that you've done it correctly, Vivian will auto cast Suspension the second that another character takes the field. Now let's talk about her EX special attack. Vivian's EX special attack is simple as it just deals damage while also granting 3 flight feathers, but this ability also sends Vivian into the flying state, meaning that Vivian can use her EX special attack and immediately swap to another agent as well, utilizing the swap cancel trick that I mentioned earlier. Vivian's assists are notable for 2 reasons. First, her quick assist allows her to quickly enter the Noble Woman state, and because of this, she has easier time generating flight feathers. The next reason her assists are worth mentioning is because her assist follow-up will also generate 2 flight feathers and send Vivian into the flying state, all of which leads to Vivian's massive anomaly effects. Vivian's dodge abilities are standard, but it is worth noting that Vivian's dodge counter will also allow her to enter into the Noble Woman state and transition again into the flying state. To add to this, anytime Vivian is in the Noble Woman state, she will also automatically dodge a single time, and this will reset the next time she enters into that state. Regarding her chain attack, this will also provide Vivian with 2 flight feathers like her other abilities, and yes, you guessed it, this also allows her to enter the fluttering frog state. Finally, her ultimate is a decent damage skill, but what's more important is the massive 5 additional flight feathers that you get after using it. In addition to this though, as usual and with most of Vivian's kit, she can also use this to begin flying / entering into the fluttering frog state. Before we get into the teams, let me take a moment to re-explain the format of my testing. First, the teams listed in this next section always had Vivian or the main Anomaly / DPS's additional ability active unless they were being paired with Astra. Second, I also decided to test triple Anomaly and even non-Anomaly DPS characters with Vivian in teams as well, but given the nature of her kit, most of these tests were not very worth it. As a result, many of the findings were not worth investigating further. But finally, I do want to remind players of the following. Just because a team is powerful doesn't mean that it's always worth using. In certain content, stacking all of your strongest units together can actually actively hurt your overall progression, so be mindful of this when using these results. Now let's talk about the standards and setup I used. The following teams had M6 on A ranks, M0 on S ranks, and the signature W engine / reasonable options of every character. This means a character like Lycone would have a signature, and someone like Piper would have Roaring Ride, but additional changes were sometimes made if a W engine performed too unrealistically. And on a final note, as always, these findings need context and nuance because things like the fight, the target, an enemy's stun meter, their buffs, and other factors can definitely affect these results. The first team I used had Vivian paired alongside another Anomaly agent and a support. Among my results, the usual suspects like Miyabi ended up performing the best, especially in content that focused on more burst / lower health targets, but keep in mind that Miyabi Vivian is especially powerful in the current state of ZenlessZoneZero, as bosses like the Twin Marionettes and the Dead End Butcher have ice and ether weaknesses together. That said, though virtually any Anomaly agent when paired with Vivian performed well, Piper, Grace, and Jane were shockingly powerful despite being characters that were otherwise slightly or decently overlooked in recent patches. Despite this, Vivian Jane Astra was one of the fastest and highest performing clears across all content in clear times, but to give some brief context for why this is the case, Jane's Anomaly being so high allowed Vivian to boost the team's performance by a significant amount. Side note, in longer content like with Deadly Assault, this gap in increased performance was even more obvious. Now, although it is clear that any 2 Anomaly agents plus Astra will perform amazingly, I did have findings for non-Astra teams too. Aside from an obvious first place finish from Miyabi Vivian Lucy or Miyabi Vivian Nicole, teams like Vivian Yanagi Nicole and Vivian Bernice Nicole also had great showings too. Despite being Astraless, these were still teams that put up very competitive showings with only roughly a 20% gap compared to the Astra-powered alternatives, but that said, in terms of feeling and play, some compositions felt less comfortable as a team lineup, like with Vivian, Bernice, and Nicole. This team did feel like it struggled at times to have a dedicated main field DPS, but overall the performance of said team was still noteworthy and impressive to say the least. In terms of supports that performed well, Sokaku, Nicole, and Lucy were all amazing for their own specific reasons. The highlight for Sokaku and Nicole were the fact that they share uncommonly high anomaly application rates compared to other supports, and because of this they were much easier and higher performing in the tests that I conducted with Vivian. By contrast, Lucy had her own value in being an easier way for Vivian to access her flying state, but in addition to this, Lucy's team-wide attack increase and M6 anomaly application also generated notable differences in performance. Now regarding recommendations for this style of team composition, I actually found that using any anomaly agent that suited the weakness type to usually be the best play, even if other characters may have been quote-unquote stronger. Regardless if it was swapping to something like Vivian Piper or Vivian Yanagi for unknown corruption complex, using the weaknesses of the enemy to Vivian's advantage was very helpful and resulted in much better performances. That said, despite the best teams with Vivian being Miyabi or Yanagi involved, it is worth noting that Jane, Grace, and Piper saw the greatest increase in performance when paired with Vivian specifically. Now, although I've received hundreds of questions on videos like these about every iteration of team composition possible, Vivian stands out as a character who still really only prefers having another anomaly agent and a support agent as her preferred 3-person lineup. While this is the case, I do acknowledge that some of you are probably still interested in how non-anomaly support teams hold up, and so here were my findings. To start, Ellen and Juyuan were two DPS that I was the most curious about, since Ether and Ice are both elements that Vivian would synergize with the best in theory, but after testing and evaluating different fights, this was not as amazing as you'd think. These teams, when paired with Astra, did perform decently, especially in short/more burst focused content, and to be clear, the team was still able to reach over 3 stars when testing them in Deadly Assault. However, both of these scenarios were against enemies that were Ether and Ice weak, so their actual performance against neutral enemies or compared to other DPS would be lower as a result. Now, something worth noting here as well is that although Astra pairs very well with Vivian and Juyuan especially, as entering the Fluttering Frog state through quick assists makes Vivian's downtime much less harmful. Moving on from exclusively Juyuan and Ellen though, other options were much worse and involved several other complicated factors like boss buffs or team setup when assessing their performance. So in short, although Ellen and Juyuan were definitely still viable, especially if you were pairing them with someone like Astra, using teams that didn't have Astra or using DPS that weren't Ellen and Juyuan definitely made performances worse. That said, my curiosity actually got the best of me, and I went out of my way to specifically compare the Ellen and Juyuan Astra teams to Ellen and Juyuan Nicole teams. When performing these tests, my results were much worse, and the reliance that Vivian had on Astra was way more apparent, so do with this information what you will. Now, I could go on and on for days about the different pairings and scenarios where certain teams could work, but to briefly mention other lineups, triple anomaly setups weren't amazing, and most fights where these lineups performed decently were mostly carried by the power of someone like Miyabi. As always though, this doesn't mean that other compositions couldn't work, but it just meant that they performed worse by comparison to other possible teams. Now, with all the teams out of the way, I did have thoughts on the best team lineup and my own personal recommended lineup. Between all compositions tested, teams that involved Miyabi and Astra were clearly the best choices for Vivian, especially given the attribute/element weaknesses of bosses like the Marionettes and even the Butcher. However, characters like Miyabi and Astra are able to clear even without someone like Vivian, and as a result, if you are someone who's missing Bernice and want to play Jane or Piper to their full potential, I'd actually then recommend using Vivian as the secondary anomaly agent for those teams as opposed to Miyabi or Astra's. Now that the teams and kits have been explained though, let's talk about Trigger's pre-farm materials. Vivian needs 3,705,000 dennies for upgrading her skills and ascensions. She also needs 30 controller seals, 32 advanced anomaly seals, and 4 basic anomaly seals to ascend Vivian to 60. In terms of her actual levels, she will need 300 senior investigator logs to level up to 60, and following this, she'll also need 250 specialized, 75 advanced, and 25 basic ether chips, alongside 5 hamster cage passes for all skills to be leveled to 12. To completely upgrade her core passive, you'll also need 9 sycophant refinements from Bringer, but at the end of this all, you'll also need 60 thunderous dragon drops from Thracian in Expert Challenge. Now, if you're looking to pull and upgrade her signature W engine, you'll also need 400,000 dennies, 30 specialized, 32 reinforced, and 4 anomaly components, and 200 W engine energy modules to level said W engine as well. Now, although Vivian really only has one amazing set to use as her 4-piece effect, there are other options to consider as backup options. Aside from Phaethon's Melody, using something like Freedom Blues or even Swing Jazz is a viable alternative until you've farmed a usable melody set. But ultimately, the set that's designed for her is clearly going to be better for her than any others. In terms of her 2-piece set, using an anomaly providing effect like Chaos Jazz or Freedom Blues will also do amazingly, since Vivian scales better with raw anomaly as opposed to any other stat. But to be clear, there is an argument for using something like Swing Jazz, as Vivian is pretty reliant on using her special attack to generate feathers / enter into the flying state. For W engine choice, her signature is easily her best option, but actually as of the time of this recording, the second best W engine that I would have recommended is actually Yanagi's signature, known as Time Weaver. However, though it's been months since the powerful passive attached to this W engine has remained bugged, it was actually changed and edited as of this 1.7 patch. As a result, though it is still a competitive option in most cases, keep in mind that this has been fixed as of this recording. But enough about S ranks, let's talk about A ranks. For Vivian, her best free-to-play choice is Gemini, but Electro Lip Gloss doesn't perform poorly either, assuming you have it at rank 5. That said, Electro Lip Gloss and even Gemini do have their own set of weaknesses, so personally I would stick to Weeping Gemini, as it isn't a W engine that you'd have to buy or receive off of a battle pass. And now finally, here are the pros and cons for Vivian after extensively testing her. Pros: she is on par with, or even better sometimes, in terms of buffing other anomaly agents' viability, and on that note, she does make characters like Jane, Piper, or Grace either strong or at least viable. She is also pretty easy to play despite the various mechanics that complicate her kit. She also has a hybrid playstyle of dealing a lot of damage off field, but still shows up on screen and on field quite often since her resource needs to be replenished. But finally, in addition to the fact that she's the only ether anomaly agent that we have access to, playing her does mean you can kind of fly. Now in terms of her cons, her viability with non-anomaly agents can feel restrictive, though that's not really the point of her kit anyway. But in addition to this, her W engine is quite powerful and versatile if for some reason you choose not to pull for it. Ultimately though guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you guys got a better idea about Vivian's teams and whether or not you should pull for her. And overall, I appreciate all you guys who have been giving support, feedbacks, and love to my videos. Thanks again for watching though. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.